Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on Shaka Live is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kawale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you today?
I'm hugely terrific.
Before we go to Shaka, let's welcome all our Facebook followers watching us live from all over the world. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask some questions and in fact get a chance to talk to Shaka himself. Shaka, today we are talking about the developments in Southern Africa, and we'll also maybe talk briefly about what's going on in Uganda. But first, let's go to South Africa. They had a remarkable election. They have a new kid on the block getting into a leadership position. He's been part of the leadership in South Africa, but this is probably the first time that he's going to be leading the biggest political party in South Africa, and that is Cyril Ramaphosa. Your take on that, Shaka?
Incredible. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa, first of all, used to be the Secretary General of the ANC. As a matter of fact, he was so good, especially when he became the key negotiator to pretty much end really what we knew as apartheid in South Africa. And he was so impressive that the Madiba himself, the man who is credited for obviously being the founding father of a democratic South Africa, Nelson Mandela, wanted him to succeed him in State House. But unfortunately, at that time, he was vetoed by the ANC, and it is the ANC wing of the party, which really is the key traditionally, made up of those who were in exile. So there was a sense that unless you were actually in exile, short of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 and a half years on Robben Island and some other places, you couldn't claim to be president of South Africa. And Mr. Ramaphosa obviously has proved otherwise.
Obviously, he had a very an uphill battle to get to the top. He had a fierce competitor who happens to be the ex-wife of the current president, Jacob Zuma, Nkosazana Dramani Zuma, who happened to be a very, very competitive person herself, and she had the credentials to probably take over that leadership position. What happened, Shaka?
I think democracy worked. South Africa has obviously demonstrated the fact that it is arguably the only country where democracy is working. As you said, of course, as you rightly said, you had Dr. Dramani Zuma, very well qualified for that particular position, but also having the advantage, for example, of the key support of the incumbent president, Jacob Zuma, who obviously happens to be, her former husband. So they had all these resources and a lot of things and goodwill and what have you, but eventually it boiled down to the average ANC delegate. South Africa, unlike a lot of other African countries, there is freedom of expression. There is the idea that you are free. You can actually do what you want to do, so long as whatever you want to do is within the law. And I think what happened was Cyril Ramaphosa, a kid who was born in Soweto, and he will obviously, if he becomes president in 2012 when they have elections, who knows, he could even become president, in fact, before then. He will have been the first kid from Soweto to be president and sit in the Union House in Pretoria. This man comes from a very small, some would say politically and socially insignificant community.
The Venda.
The Venda. Yeah. The Venda, they're very, very small. You can't compare them with Zulu or Kotsa and what have you. And in fact, that particular group was actually even looked down upon socially and politically. And I was told at some point that if you are part of the vendor, you probably don't really have any business trying to aspire to become the #1 citizen of the Republic of South Africa. Obviously, it looks like Cyril Ramaphosa becomes an exception.
It's interesting that you talk about his background in that light. There are people who argue that despite the fact that he has come from very humble beginnings, a very small community, he's arguably one of the richest men in town, in the country, so to speak. He's also married to the daughter of the richest person in South Africa.
The daughter or the sister?
Yes.
The sister of the richest.
Yes,
one of
and
the
so
richest people.
that makes them a very, very powerful couple. But besides that, there are people who argue that he is actually a sellout. He has not done much for his people, yet he has benefited on the backs of the people who put him there.
You know, of course, he has never been president. It is the first time that he actually gets a crack at the presidency. So I think it would be premature, honestly, for us to prejudge him. I think we should give him the benefit of the doubt and see, in fact, whether he makes it to the presidency. And once he does, we'll be looking at the policies, frankly, that he comes up with. Mind you, the ANC is also a very democratically organized political party, unlike a lot of really political parties on the continent. It has 6 people at the top who form really the policy-making body. And in fact, when you look at the people who were voted in and what have you, it seems to me it is a split between those who supported Mr. Ramaphosa and those who obviously come from the background that supports the Zumas and what have you. So it seems to me that you are going to have actually a variety of views, or divergent views, which is healthy for democracy. Because democracy is not about monopolizing anything. Democracy is being in a position where you negotiate, and eventually you sort of compromise. That is when democracy becomes really what it should be. By the way, this is a very interesting man because apart from being born in Soweto, his father was a policeman. He's also a man, obviously, who has benefited out of the ANC policy of black empowerment. That's how he made his money. He was the chairman, for example, of MTN. Yeah, you know MTN, of course, in the business of cell phones and all that kind of stuff.
The biggest career on the continent.
Biggest career on the continent.
Yeah.
He also was, in fact, the owner of McDonald's South Africa. He was in a lot of other things, and also he's a farmer, by the way, and you cannot believe this, Paul. He actually visited Uganda, where, of course, there is a subsidiary of MTN, which is chaired by a kid from Kabale called Charles Mbire. And he met with President Yoweri Museveni. President Yoweri Museveni took him to his farm. He admired the Ankole cattle. And guess what? He actually bought more than 40 Ankole cows, which were taken to Kenya for figuring out scientifically how they can actually make them fit in the climate of Southern Africa. And apparently, the last time I checked, he now has more than 100 cows that you call Ankole cattle. He's a very interesting man.
Interesting. What's at stake for him? Obviously, yeah, he takes on the mantle from Jacob Zuma, who has been grappling with a lot of corruption charges. The country is not doing very well economically, politically. That's also debatable. There are so many things at stake. So what does he need to do to reunite the country, to bring the people together? When you look at how people voted, they voted along I guess, along 2 lines, one supporting him and another one supporting Mrs. Zuma. So what does he need to do to keep South Africa going forward?
It was a sort of really a split vote because people were saying that it was too close to call. In which case, what he has to do, frankly, is to figure out a way of bringing everybody together. First of all, you can look at the reaction, especially from, like foreign investors and what have you, They like, especially, they like the fact that they can deal with a Ramaphosa, who obviously happen also to be probably part of their club, because this is not a guy who is poor. He's one of the richest people in South Africa. He is very much, for example, supported by people who are in business. He's very much supported by people who are potential investors and what have you. And you can see how the banks reacted, for example, the stock exchange, Johannesburg Stock Exchange and what have you, everything is right on the money. But what about the ordinary guy in South Africa? Can he, in fact, identify with that ordinary guy in Soweto where he was born and grew up? Can he do that? Everybody is waiting to see whether, in fact, he can. Because the person, in fact, who was supposed to be very strong in terms of reflecting populist, types of policies and what have you, who felt that you did have really figured out a way of, sort of dealing with this huge inequality between the white former rulers of South Africa, who still economically control pretty much everything, really. That you have to figure out a way of creating jobs, providing opportunities, especially in education and what have you, and bringing out the indigenous South African blacks. He has to figure out a way how to hold the backs, really, of the people who look like the kid that was growing up in Soweto.
Shaka, you bring up a very interesting point. When you talk to a lot of people, especially from that region, they seem to say that despite the fact that ANC has been at the mantle of power, they have been in leadership position since the end of the apartheid regime. Nothing has really changed for black people, apart from a person like Ramaphosa, who has benefited from that black empowerment, a policy that was brought in by ANC to benefit people who are very close to, who had very close business interests with the regime. The ordinary folk has not benefited from this whole system. Actually, some people have argued that maybe some of these black folks were better off during apartheid than they are today. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
I think that those critics probably maybe generalizing simply too much, really. I have had about 2 or 3 occasions to visit South Africa, and I have seen some kind of difference really going on. It is true that there's a lot that has still to be done, but there's no question that there are some significant improvements. For example, there are more black people, for example, that attend university than at any one time before. These are kids that are going to get modern skill sets that are going to allow them, enable them, participate in a modern economy. A person like Ramaphosa, he is who he became because he went to university. You were talking about Ramaphosa. He's a lawyer by training. And by the way, he also has a lot of honorary doctorate degrees from a lot of universities, both in his own country and in this particular country here. One of them, in fact, is from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia.
An Ivy League school.
Yeah. An Ivy League school. Another one is from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, in Massachusetts. He has also actually taught law at one of the most prestigious law schools in this country and indeed the world, Stanford Law School, Stanford University in Palo Alto. So he is the man of the world. People also forget, by the way, that he is not only a great negotiator to end apartheid, but he was also part of a group that actually helped to mediate the conflict in Northern Ireland. He was also, in fact, approached by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan back in 2007 to actually chair the team that was mediating the Kenyan conflict. But because Mwai Kibaki, who happened to be president at that time, somehow suspected that there was a very keen, perhaps commercial relationship between Ramaphosa and Raila Amolo Odinga. So the man did not, in fact, get the chance to mediate the Kenyan political crisis. He voluntarily resigned because he felt that the only way you can be a mediator if you have the confidence of both parties. This is a man that probably, when he becomes president, could probably become the first genuine type of leader you could actually characterize as a new breed of African leaders. And probably, who knows, the beacon of hope for African democracy, not the type of leaders who were characterized as such during the Clinton administration. You know, you remember talking about Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea, Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, of course he is now since died, Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, who of course as we talk is trying to do a bit of political constitutional goalposts, you know, shifting the goalposts so that he could in fact end up becoming a presidential monarch. You have a Paul Kagame, you have, in fact, you couldn't believe this, but you also had Laurent Desire Kabila, who, these were people who Washington saw as the new breed of African leaders and the beacons of hope for African democracy. I remember, in fact, in 1997, I was at State Lounge or State House, Nakasero, when the U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was actually addressing a media of both Western and local. And she pointed at Yoweri Museveni next to him and said, "You are the beacon of hope for African democracy." I looked at her and I said, what is she talking about? You know, there is a saying, Paul, that time is the greatest friend. I mean, rather, time is the greatest friend of the truth. Correct?
Yes.
Time is the greatest friend of the truth. I think I have since been proven. Our constant
enemy is?
Our constant enemy is ignorance
and prejudice.
Or prejudice.
Yes.
Not her constant. That is her worst enemy, because her constant companion happens to be humility. Humility.
Yeah. Shaka, that's a perfect segue for us to transition to Uganda. Let's go to some Facebook comments here. Let's start with Okoit Joshua. What's the political future of Uganda following the current age limit debate? Your thoughts?
You know, let's face it, it is Ugandans who should actually determine the political future of their country. They should not allow some of this kind of game that is being played. Let's face it, the last time I actually looked at what appeared to be public opinion poll, I don't know really whether the poll was scientific, but it seems to be very realistic. Majority of the people of Uganda, according to that poll, overwhelmingly are against amending the constitution so that the incumbent President Yoweri Museveni can become a presidential monarch. Now, you have the members of parliament who are obviously voted in parliament by their various constituencies. They now have to prove and demonstrate who do they in fact work for. Do they work for the people who voted for them, or do they work for the Ugandan president who has arguably, allegedly bribed them with each of them about 8,000 US dollars, which of course also happens to be the taxpayers' money. We're talking about the taxpayers' money, the Ugandan taxpayers' money. This money is not coming from Yoweri Museveni's, account. It's not coming from Yoweri Museveni's farm. No, it is the taxpayers' money being used to, in a sense, compromise these members of parliament in order for somebody, frankly, to be king. Now, wait a minute. You know, back in 2005, there was the issue of removing term limits. And this was the key, because if we had not seen the removal of term limits in Uganda in 2005, we wouldn't be here today. At that time, the president reportedly bribed the members of parliament about $3,000 each only. And they changed the constitution. Later, when the president is actually being interviewed and said, wait a minute, you are the man, for example, when you took power, you seized the power back in 1986. You actually said the problem of Africa is leaders who overstay in power. Why are you removing the term limit so that you can be, can remain president? He said he succumbed to the pressure. Whose pressure was he succumbing from? It couldn't really have been the Ugandan people. If it was the Ugandan people, there was no need for him to have been in a position of bribing, which he calls facilitating, $3,000 each to a member of parliament in order to vote in his favor. So right now, if you look at, for example, the public opinion poll, which suggests that Ugandans overwhelmingly reject anybody touching the constitution. In fact, they call it in the local Luganda language, tojikwatako. You don't touch the constitution. What is he going to say now? That he is also again succumbing to pressure? To whose pressure?
But there are people who argue, for example, people on the ruling party side who argue that even in the Western world, in the United States, in Britain, all these countries that pride themselves of having a great or a perfect democracy, there is no cap when it comes to how old you have to be in office. For example, inside United States, we have President Donald Trump. He's over 70 years.
Yeah, but he's not.
We have other leaders in the West who are over 70 years. So why should a Ugandan president who has had the privilege of being in that position not serve beyond 75 years of age? Isn't that a fair question?
I think it is a fair question, but in this particular case, you have to provide it with context. And in fact, I am tempted to quote Yoweri Museveni's very interesting phrase, which is, that is a red herring. A red herring, meaning it is diversionary. Because let's face it, it is true that you don't necessarily need to have age limit really. And in fact, age limit wasn't there. It was inserted there on the watch of Yoweri Museveni. And he did it precisely because, guess what? He was actually blocking a specific individual called a former Ugandan president, Dr. Apollo Milton Obote, so that he could not actually take part in subsequent elections. But you see, it is very, very interesting that he is also the same person who provided this thing called term limits. The Ugandan constitution did not have term limits. But when it comes to him, everything has to be somehow manipulated in such a way that it reflects his interests, not the interests of anybody else. So, in fact, it is okay. If he wanted to remove the term limits, frankly, and that would be a reflection probably of, in national interest and what have you, he didn't have to bribe members of parliament. In fact, he could say, yes, let us remove the age cap, but under no circumstances am I personally going to benefit from that. If that was the case, it would be fine. But I don't see under what circumstances, frankly, he could actually bribe or compromise members of parliament just because of such a principle. No, it's about him.
Yeah, in fact, you just brought up a very interesting argument. Maybe I'll go back to the comments. Kalisila Obed, Mbeya, Uganda, he wonders why should it take a foreign intervention for Africans to rise up and take care of their own matters? Maybe I could also add that you just brought up an issue here where in this bill, the particular bill 102B that they are fighting about, they are talking about, they have inserted in a clause that they want to amend the constitution because they think that having 5-year term, a person doesn't get to do what he's supposed to do in those 5 years. So they are basically, they want to change it to amend it to make it a 7-year term for the president and a 7-year term for members of parliament. Would you agree with that kind of argument they're putting forward?
You see, when we start talking about that kind of argument, to be honest with you, we are no longer talking about a constitution as we have come to know it. I mean, I agree that a constitution, for example, is a living document and therefore can actually be legitimately amended. But you amend it in such a way that that amendment reflects or is within, in fact, national interests, not personal interests. When it reaches that point, then it ceases to be a constitution. In fact, it becomes a personal manifesto. You change the document whenever it doesn't suit you. And it's like you have two teams really playing football. And for you, it is okay to score. But when it comes to your opponent, when he approaches the goalpost, you have the power and you have the ability to shift the goalposts so that your opponent cannot score. This is what is going on in Uganda. We're not talking about a constitution here because, first of all, let's face it, when a president either seizes power or assumes power, what does he do? If he's a Christian, he raises the Bible and swears to defend and protect and uphold. If you really supposed to be the guardian of that constitution, why should you change it when you feel that it doesn't reflect your personal interests? I should see the international community weighing in here and saying, you know what, if you do that, we are not going to do business with you. We'll treat you just like somebody who is a colonel who sees the power through AK-47.
Shaka, what are you talking about tomorrow?
Tomorrow we are talking about U.S.-Zimbabwean relations.
Interesting. Okay, let's final quick question. A personal question from Charles Kembe Kampewa from Zambia. He wants to know whether you have political ambitions, that you've been out in the West for a long time, and isn't it about time for you to go back and maybe aspire for political office?
You know, I really don't know exactly why he has to say that. All I can say is that at least at the moment, I am comfortable being an advocate of social, economic justice for all of us.
Let's go to very quick, briefly. Panther, how could you talk about African politics while you are not in Africa? For the record, the way you and your team reported on the ongoing crisis in South Sudan shows that African journalists are something else. They don't represent Africa. Very quickly.
I don't know what he's going to talk about because we do not invent civil wars. We do not invent refugees. We report on events that unfold. And in fact, we probably, to be honest with you, the best thing we do is try to be servants of the truth.
Well,
nothing but the truth.
Shaka, on that note, I thank you so much for being a great guest. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time next week. To all our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in, and we look forward to talking to you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.